Hello and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris,
I'm Creston.
and this is the second time we're recording this show because mouse problems. Anyway, today we're going to talk about um, WebSockets versus polling versus server sent events versus long polling and all the ways that things can talk to other things. But before we get into that, how was your week?
Still super busy, although I'll make some announcements. The first one is that I have created a mini course and I'm calling it the PostgreSQL Performance Starter Kit.
Cool.
So this is a series of 3 videos and it's free. I mean, you sign up for the newsletter. So if you go to scalingpostgres.com/courses, you can click on it and submit your email and first and last name. I'll also put it in the show notes for this episode. But basically, it's a course that kind of gets you started doing Postgres performance stuff. But it's very basic if you've ever done any performance work from the Postgres perspective. But if you've mostly just used, your framework's console to access the database, it just shows you some pointers on how to get started. So the first lesson covers PSQL, which is the Postgres command line client. It covers pgstat statements and setting that up to be able to track what statements are running in your system, and then explain, which helps you understand how the query is being run by the system so you can optimize it. And I show an example of doing that as a part of the course. And really, this is to get anyone who's interested in taking my more comprehensive in-depth course that's coming up. That's kind of why I released this. Now, the more complex course that's all about Postgres performance optimization, that's coming. I'll have some more announcements on that later. But basically, that course, I'm planning the start date around the end of January. And but I'll have an opportunity to get in early if you're interested, around the Black Friday, Cyber Monday time, which for those outside the US, that's basically after Thanksgiving around like November 24th or something like that. So
Cool.
that's just a lot of stuff going on with me. How about you?
So, still just busy, mental exhaustion because we've got the code freeze coming up December 15th, which means if you're a new developer and you're not sure what that means, at a lot of bigger corporations especially, they will freeze development and not allow any new production deploys other than emergencies after a certain time during the holidays, so you don't get caught out in the holidays with a bunch of problems and things can
Caught out in the
stabilize.
cold.
Yeah. So we've got that coming up. But what that means is we have to push to try to get our yearly stuff all finished up by then so that we can then take a deep breath. But, the next month is really pushing hard. Not
Yeah.
to mention the fact that we just had that big acquisition, doubled the size of our engineering staff. We're trying to get all these people in at the same time. And so it's just like, driving a race car 300 miles an hour down residential roads and trying to miss all the stuff that you got to miss at 300 miles an hour. So it's pretty frantic. Lots of late nights and meetings and all the stuff. But we're making good progress, so that's good. But man, it's just exhausting. I'm gonna be ready for a break after the code freeze. I'm gonna take some vacation time and
Oh yeah.
turn the gray matter off for a while. So anyway, good but busy. All right, so WebSockets and polling and long polling and server sent events. So let's do some definitions first, for people who may not be familiar with what those things are. So polling is basically kind of the oldest way to do this stuff, which is
And
the client.
simplest.
Yeah, and simplest. Yeah, the client basically says, "Hey server, you got anything for me? Hey server, you got anything for me? Hey server, you got anything for me?" And just does that forever, over and over and over again. Um, it's kind of like a heartbeat thing. Uh, WebSockets are a like permanently open pipe, or at least as permanently as you're on this page that opened it, um, between the server and the client, and they can just talk whenever something happens. So the client doesn't have to constantly ask. It just says it asks and says, okay, server, anytime somebody sends something that I want to know about, just go ahead and shoot it to me. Don't make me ask you for it. And that be something like think of like a chat application where you get in the chat room, you've opened a pipe to the server, and anytime somebody sends a message to that, you're subscribed to that chat channel, and the server says, okay, here's a message that just got sent from wherever it got sent, and you don't have to constantly ask it for it.
And it's also bidirectional, meaning that the
Right.
client can also, when it sends its chat message up to the server, it doesn't need to make a connection. So it's already there. It just
Right.
says, hey, this is what I said. And then the server multiplexes it to everyone else on the channel.
Right. So it's kind of a pub sub thing, publish, subscribe. And that was kind of a newer way. Then there's a concept of long polling, which why don't you explain that?
So it's basically the client just as a typical request of, hey, you got anything for me? Or, hey, server, do this thing for me. And the server says, okay, hold please. It does its work. So it leaves the connection open. It does its work, or it does waiting, or whatever it's doing. When it finally has something that it needs to deliver, it says, okay, here it is. As soon as that gets delivered, the connection's dropped. So it's really for delivery, a wait time, like hold please. It's kind of like going to McDonald's. Once you get your meal, the transaction's done.
Right. The big disadvantage of that is when it puts you on hold, it usually doesn't play nice hold music for you. So, you're just sitting there waiting. But all right, so then we've got this thing called server sent events. So go ahead and explain that one.
So that one is where the client makes the connection to the server and the server keeps it open. So it's like long polling. But as opposed to just delivering one time and then dropping the connection, it can send as many events as you want over the wire to the client, and the connection just stays open. And this is interesting for doing like real-time updates of, like, maybe you're having a graph that dynamically builds stuff. You can constantly just keep those server sent events coming. Because really, when you're updating a graph, you don't need the duplex nature of a WebSocket. Like, the client doesn't constantly need to be sending something. It's just getting a stream of information,
So
like
like if
stock
you're
ticker updates.
a stock market update for day
Yeah,
traders, they've got this stuff on their screen and they're just receiving the information. They don't need to tell the server anything. They're just trying to get it.
exactly. I would say that's a good use case for server sent events. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are very much like WebSockets, except the client can't talk back is the primary
Yeah.
difference.
And the other thing to keep in mind with WebSockets is an entirely different protocol
Mm-hmm.
than HTTP. So all the things we mentioned, polling, long polling, server sent events, those are all part of HTTP. You're not using a different protocol, whereas WebSockets is an entirely separate protocol.
Right. So, when I first started web development, the thing was if you needed to have updates, consistent updates, you did polling. That's just what you did because there weren't really any other options at the time. That was back in the day of the clay tablets and stuff. So then came along the WebSockets stuff. And I mean, WebSockets had been around for a while, but they weren't really used in commercial production environments for quite some time. So when those started to be really available and used quite a bit, when you put those things on the whiteboard and you say, okay, if I'm doing polling, I'm sending 60 transactions per second up to this thing, thousands of transactions every hour, and I've got all this traffic going through. But if I do a WebSocket, then I've just got one request up per client, instead of thousands per client. So I'm going to dramatically reduce traffic. So no brainer, use WebSockets, right? But what it turns out is that in the field, you still run into people using polling instead of WebSockets. So why is that, do you think?
So I think the main reason is just simplicity. It's super simple
Mm-hmm.
to do it. And in your JavaScript, for example, you just put it on a timer and just request from the server. Either it's going to give you as a payload an HTML file or JSON, or even JavaScript, sometimes Rails does. And you just take that and you do something with it, interpret it or update whatever you need to do. So there's no additional technology to build in. You don't have to worry about another protocol, WebSockets, or transition to a different protocol and have different firewalls or have different technology. It's kind of just all built in to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, I think that's the number one reason why people still do it. Is just simple to do.
Right. And which makes sense, especially if you're in a situation where, okay, I'm just kind of, putting up a minimum viable product, a proof of concept here. There's no reason to go into all the WebSocket stuff. Let's just get it working. Then we'll reevaluate what we need. But setting aside the difficulty, and I don't want to say difficulty, it's just more involved than just doing polling. But I mean, most languages, web development languages now, have the facility to set up WebSockets, and you get they can walk you through it. It's not horrific, but it's more involved. But the other problem is, and this is the thing that you didn't see on the whiteboard, or at least we didn't, back in the early days of WebSockets coming out. We're sitting there going, hey, it's a no-brainer because it's going to dramatically reduce my traffic. But the problem is it dramatically increases your processing overhead. And that is because why?
Leaves connections open.
Yep.
And all of the technologies, other than just simple polling, leaves connections open, because a lot of web developers, particularly those who do use Ruby on Rails, are so accustomed to the server process being very temporary. Like, you just send a request to the router, it goes to the controller, does its thing, returns the data, it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Job is done. That's not how it works when you're doing long polling, server send events, and WebSockets. It has to maintain that connection for however long it is. If it's long polling, that Ruby process is going to be running until it finally delivers the payload or whatever it is to the client.
Mm-hmm.
Or server send events, that Ruby process is going to keep running around until it's closed. Same thing for WebSockets. So that's the big disadvantage.
Right. So, in dev, well, in life, nothing is free. You're going to pay for it somehow. And in this case, you're going to be robbing Peter to pay Paul. The question then becomes, all right, am I at a point where the traffic is more problematic than extra processing? Then you got to think about costs. You got to think about, loads on your servers. And because if you got to have, 1,000 times as many processes running, that's going to get expensive if you're in the cloud. As we've talked about before, cloud ain't cheap. So, there's trade-offs to be had. So am I at a point with my polling traffic that it's problematic? If it's not, switching to WebSockets just because that's the cool toy may not make sense.
You may introduce new problems.
Yeah.
Because now you have to maintain, it depends on the backend server technology, but now you have to maintain additional processes, and that has a memory impact. Particularly, that's the limitation you might hit first, and also a computational impact.
Mm-hmm. Now, long
Because,
polling
sorry, go ahead.
long polling can kind of split the difference there. It gives you some of the benefits of both of those, where I don't have to send, if I've got a thing that happens, let's say irregularly, but it's minutes apart, right? I don't have to poll every 10 seconds to find out if it happened. I just poll once, and then when it happens in 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes, it sends it back and closes the connection down. So I don't
But just
constantly
keep
have.
but just keep in mind that whole minute you have a process dedicated to that one user waiting for something.
Exactly. Right. But it will eventually close down. So
Sure.
so I get some of the I mitigate some of the issues with the WebSockets. But then I don't have the constant communication going. So if I don't ask again and some other event happens, I will know about it. So all right. So how does server sent events fit into that? Does that buy me anything over WebSockets? Why would I use that instead of a WebSocket? What difference does that make?
So if you only need to send down events from the server, again, like think stock ticker, you're just sending updated information. It's a great use case for that. You can use the HTTP spec, so you don't have to do a separate WebSocket server if you're needing to do that. So it already handles it as part of the HTTP spec. And I actually, so I mean, essentially, I think there's less infrastructure involved with implementing that.
Mm-hmm.
But but it's still the downside of keeping a process open, because I was looking at that. I was looking at a way to proxy things such that I don't have, like, if I want to support 1,000 clients, I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to have 1,000 Puma threads running,
Right.
one dedicated to each person. I want to, can I do 100 Puma threads that then help supports 1,000 clients? And I couldn't figure out how to do it.
Yeah. So if anybody
So
knows
it
how
was
to do that,
literally, it goes, yeah, if you know how to do that, and put it in the comment. Now, there is a way to do it with WebSockets, I'll mention in a second, but it's not kind of built into the Rails ecosystem. It requires a separate library. But because, like, I was using this and it kind of trying to use the server events for a use case, and it just kept the connection open on the controller. So it's like you're literally running a controller action for potentially minutes,
mm,
or it's staying open, waiting for something. So it was
right.
like, what? I'm going to have all these, I'm so used to things happening super fast and delivering and being done.
Yep.
So this will probably make your APM metrics all wonky if you start trying to do some of this stuff,
Right.
because suddenly your controller action is taking minutes to complete.
Yeah, and that always hurts when you see that.
Yeah.
Um
So
so I mean, most of what I used in my career was either the polling or the WebSockets. I didn't really deal with the other. I used long polling a couple of times, but for specific situations. But mostly it was one of those two. Um, and honestly, when I was still doing front end stuff, I don't have to deal with that anymore. So this isn't a problem for me. But you know, it's an interesting thought experiment, because when you lay these things out on a whiteboard, and this is kind of educational for a lot of how to think about dev architecture and what you're doing, and the ramifications it has. When you lay these things out on a whiteboard, it looks very obvious which one you should use for any given situation. I would just always use WebSockets, right? If I'm just looking at a whiteboard, WebSockets. Why would I ever use anything else? But there's a lot of hidden costs to those things that you don't think about, and that's instructive, because when you're developing, when you're writing stuff, one of the mistakes I see people make a lot of times is not thinking ahead to, well, what ripple effects is this going to have? If I write this way, what is it going to do to the infrastructure, the servers I have to put it on, the things I have to deal with, the technology outside of this piece of code? and I think it's a good example. This is a very simple example of things like that, because once you took this off the whiteboard, it was real easy to see that, oh, I've got process issues here. Yeah, I've eliminated my traffic problem, but holy crap, this just got, 1,000 times as expensive or whatever it was. And my
Yeah.
APM is having a fit on the processor side now instead of the traffic side. So, um,
Yeah. So this is now there, in terms of talking about the WebSockets for a second here, like we predominantly use Ruby on Rails and they do have Action Cable.
mhm,
And as I was looking at that, people were reporting it works okay once you get up to about 1,000 clients, and then it starts kind of like not working as well. And I wonder if it's because of this keeping connection open business.
mhm,
Um, I don't, unfortunately, I don't know because I actually never committed Action Cable because the requirement from a particular client was, hey, we want to support 5,000 clients. So I'm like, okay, well, then based on what I'm hearing, I shouldn't do this. But I found this other solution called Action Cable.
mhm.
And what that actually does is it doesn't use Ruby, it uses Go for the WebSocket connections. And so I think it may be it kind of acts like, excuse me, like this proxy that I was talking about. So
Mm,
it can support thousands of connections, but yet you don't need as many Ruby processes to do it. It kind of handles it some way.
right.
So do other frameworks have that requirement? Um, I have seen a lot of people use like Socket.io, which might do something similar based upon other frameworks that you're using. But yeah, it's definitely a problem. And I have seen like Elixir says it can support 1 million WebSockets on a single server.
Wow, that's a bold claim.
Well, they did implement with what they showed. Now the question is, okay, how much memory was each process using? How much CPU was at work was actually being done in the maintenance of it and whatnot. So, you know,
Right.
it,
Yeah,
it
how
it- you
big
know,
is
it
that server?
the answer is it kind of depends.
Right.
But then this is where it gets interesting. It's something we haven't talked about. Another disadvantage is that, okay, let's say you go with the WebSockets and then suddenly you want to support, let's say you're using something that a single server can't handle 5,000 WebSockets. This is just a theoretical
Mhm.
argument. All right, well, then you need another server. Well, then the problem is so many load balancers can't do WebSockets, or I've actually seen where you actually need to be then implement a message broker,
Yeah.
and things start getting complicated really fast. And there are all these providers that say, hey, we do the WebSockets for you. And
Right.
so then you're paying the money to do it. Or any cable, like I was giving an example, they have their pro version. And it's basically, this is not necessarily what I think they have said, but my interpretation, all right, well, we'll probably have to start paying for that if we ever need to go multi-server with any cable,
Right.
just because the complexity it's not like bringing up another web server that has HA proxy. It's not that easy with your typical Rails application where the client's just sending something. Because then there's also problems like in terms of load balancing. I remember someone writing a post. Sorry, I couldn't find it again, but they said, all right, well, we're going to bring up a new WebSocket server because they have more um, traffic coming in, but only new people would go there
Mhm.
because there was no way to, without, again, additional technology to do it, to redirect existing users to go to a different WebSocket on a different server.
Right. And that was something I ran into early on when we started using WebSockets. We got the WebSockets all set up, and they were working great, but then we kind of outgrew things and needed to set up load balancers and distributed processing and stuff, which, like you said, is easy to do with a request response cycle, because
Yeah, exactly.
I'm done after I send the request and
Yeah.
get the response. But when you start trying to implement that with WebSockets, it got really confusing, because we were like, oh wait, we can't just send this pipe over to another place. It has to stay here as long as this person is connected. So now I've got to worry about, okay, if this part of my load balancer gets full, I may or may not get that back anytime soon. And if, God forbid, something were to happen and it goes down, I can't just move those connections over. The client has to reconnect,
Oh, it
which, I
has to be,
mean,
yeah,
yeah,
it reinitiate,
right,
reinitialize things. I mean, it can be done, but it's more disruptive for the client.
right,
Whereas if you were using polling, the state isn't going to be as significant, because, like, imagine you're doing a chat app with a WebSockets. You probably have a whole chat history of what's happening, but if that server suddenly goes down, I bet most of that chat history may be erased because it's had to connect backed up as if it was a new client into something.
right. Which you run into even with like Zoom or Google. I forget which one does it, but if there's chat going on and you join the room, you get chat from the first time you got one. And then if you get disconnected and come back in, you don't see what you saw before. It starts fresh. So,
Yeah. Yep. And part of the reason I actually wanted to talk about this, or I suggested this as a set of topics, is that for a client, I actually reversed their WebSocket usage and I went to straight old polling.
yep.
So because the request of this particular client was, hey, we want to be able to support 10,000 connections. So I started thinking about it. I was like, okay, this may mean having multiple WebSocket servers, getting this additional technology to be able to handle this stuff. And then I said, could I do this with polling? Because essentially it just needs, well, first I tried server sent events, and then that didn't fly at all because of the process having to stay open. So I'm like, well,
Mm-hmm.
good Lord, I'm going to need 10,000 processes to handle this.
Right.
Now I could spread it out to multiple boxes. So that is, I think, would that be, it'll work easier. It might be easier to use that than the WebSockets, but still you're going to run into that problem.
Yeah.
So I just basically said, okay, can I poll to be able to do this? And they wanted something real time. I said, yeah, but does it really need to be real time? This was mostly me talking about it as opposed to talking with them. How important, So what I basically did is I set up polling, set it as polling to say, hey, has something changed? Hey, has something changed? And I did it. Um, I, I'm trying to think what it was configured. It was like might have been something like every 2 to 5 seconds. So it's a random value how often it polls every
Mm-hmm.
time between 2 to 5 seconds. So as opposed to all clients, poll, no, poll, it was just more distributed when the
Yeah.
server was being hit. And what it was returning was a JSON that had two values in it. So the payload was super small,
Mm-hmm.
and I made the controller as efficient as possible. And it basically returned in like, oh gosh, what was it? I think it may have been like 2 milliseconds
That's pretty good.
on average. It was super. It was just do the simplest thing. Just say, hey, is an update needed? And
Mm-hmm.
then if an update is needed, then it does a separate connection to say, okay, give me what changed.
Yep.
So with that, I'm like, And then I did the scale out and put multiple servers up, and then was able to hit the 10,000 requirement in the testing.
Right.
So I kind of looked at the prospect of doing the WebSockets. I said, can I go back to just use
Right.
this other tech? And it worked. And the client really didn't see it was real time enough, put it that way. Like
Right. Yeah.
that delay of maybe 2 to 3 seconds, and then it sends a request and gets the drawdown. That was
Enough.
real time enough. Yeah.
Right. And that's another thing to think about too, is that, the non-polling strategies, the other ones, they are scalable, but the scalability of those things gets very complicated very quickly, especially the full WebSocket one. So, I mean, you can throw tons of money at it and tons of time and teams at it, and you can scale it to 10,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000. But my Lord, you better have a lot of money and a lot of time if you're going to do that, because it's
Yeah.
complex.
Yeah. Or you're paying what I would have done is paid a vendor to handle the multi server WebSockets implementation.
Right. But I can tell you from what we're going through at my job, that can also get extraordinarily expensive very
I'm not
quick.
saying it won't. I'm
And
not saying it
we're
won't.
at, because we've got the same problem. A lot of our stuff was built on WebSockets, and we're actually going through and pulling some of that back to just polling, because the expense of dealing with that many users on WebSockets is just too high, and it's not buying us enough to justify that kind of expense. When there was 100 users, sure, it was great, but tens of
Yeah.
thousands,
Yeah. That's when it,
you just can't do it.
yeah, you're
Um,
dedicating. Yeah. Here's the where it starts to fall down is that you're dedicating a process one to one per person.
mhm,
Whereas with all the other, with polling, for example, I could only have 50 processes that are serving 1,000 users.
right,
And the difference is, that's just an example, but it could, depending on how infrequently you poll, you could support even more and more users for a given
right.
number of
And it's
CPUs or whatever.
it's much easier and cheaper to scale traffic than it is to scale processes, especially when you got to be careful about where those processes are and what they're connected to.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it's still, it still affects me emotionally thinking,
sure.
oh, the 98% of the time we're just pull, just doing absolutely nothing. So it's an affront to, I think, our, we're wasting clock cycles. But at the end of the day, there are cases where it's a cheaper option.
Right. Cheaper, easier, and better for the user in a lot of cases. Because if you're doing polling and you lose a connection for 5 seconds, so what? It just picks back up where it was.
Yep.
You know nothing. If you lose a connection with a WebSocket, somebody better have written that very well so that it knows, hey, I lost this connection. I need to put it back so the user isn't confused. Which is, again, kind of hard to do.
Yep.
So anyway, if you're going to do WebSockets or long polling or server sent events, we're not saying they're bad. They are good. They have uses, very good uses. Um, but think about things like cost and scalability when you get to an app size that's more than 1,000 users. You're going to start thinking, oh gosh, maybe I should go to polling.
Yeah. This is one of those things that your technology decision can really cause pain later on if you have a successful app.
Yeah. So my recommendation would be, WebSockets sound great, and they really are, but make sure you really understand how those things work, or the server sent events or the long polling. Understand how they work so that you understand what you're going to get yourself into if growth happens.
Yeah, and if you need them. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, do start with the polling, evaluate your traffic, and see if it's worth the effort and expense to switch to something else. Just because it sounds better and doesn't offend my sensibilities of, hey, we're wasting a lot of traffic here. But it's better than
Yeah.
wasting a lot of money and time.
I mean, I think chat is an example that WebSockets are a really good use case
Yeah.
for, because not
Mm-hmm.
everybody is going to be doing a real-time chat. Like if you think of a support app, very, I would think, given the amount of customers that are supported looking at documentation and versus actually chatting with someone online, that's a very small portion of what the server does. So they're dedicating WebSockets for that one singular purpose of chatting with someone.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to have, well, it depends on your scale, but you're going to have many more requests coming in for documentation, other types of things for the application compared to chatting with someone.
Yeah.
So I think there are certain use cases that the chat is a no-brainer because things are going to be relatively happening pretty quickly. So dedicating a process to that person chatting probably makes sense.
Right. And things like long polling, like I've seen them used for, hey, server, run me this report, and I'll just keep my long
I could
poll
see,
open to
yeah,
let me
yeah,
know when it's done, instead of turning around and sending me an email with a background job or something. It's also valid, but that's a reasonable use case for like a long poll, because I only need to do it once, and then when that report's done in a minute, minute and a half, you release that connection, we go on. I'm not asking for those every second. So that's usually not a
yeah.
scalability issue.
And what I do with that is I still just use straight up polling. I just like
Yeah,
every 5-10 seconds say, "Are you done? No, okay." And then when it's done, it just updates something that says, "Okay, your report's ready." So I still use polling for that.
right. And so I think a lot of this too, what you need to think about is, what is the user experience going to be like? And are any of these things going to help me improve the user experience for my users? Um, because if regular polling gives the user a great experience and doesn't kill your
Yeah.
server, why would you do something else? You need to have a reason, and there are reasons, but make sure you have one.
Yeah.
So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed that. That was a fun convo. If you did, hey, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, share this with your friends,
But
ding that
also,
notification bell.
also let us know if you run into issues using things other than polling, if you've fallen back to polling in some use cases, or you're like, or if you say you guys are nuts, WebSockets is the jam, I love it, then
Yeah,
let us know in the comments.
yeah, give us some comments. We like to learn from you guys. So make sure you do that. If you prefer to listen to this as a podcast while you're jogging or swimming or mountain climbing, whatever your jam is, you can find us on pretty much any podcast provider. We're at pretty much all of them. Also, we've got short form videos on there. We have a team of folks that takes our long videos, our shows, and cuts them apart into little segments that you can watch or listen to quickly. So check those out on the channel. And we will be back next week with some new stuff. We haven't decided exactly yet, but we'll get that out there. Don't worry, we'll have something. So until until next week, happy programming.
Happy programming.